This is Mission Control Houston. We want to welcome you to Space Station Live. It is Monday, August 26, 2013. This is a live view inside the flight control room here at the Johnson Space Center. This team today is being led by Flight Director Ron Spencer. He is sitting there in the center console on the right-hand side of the screen. Sitting beside him is today's Capcom, David St. Jacques from the Canadian Space Agency. He'll be the one talking with the crew on board the orbiting complex. The Expedition 36 crew includes Commander Pavel Vinogradov, who is sitting there second from the left. On the far left is Alexander Mazurkin. There in the center screen is Chris Cassidy, a NASA astronaut. And right beside him is Luca Parmitano from the Italian Space Agency. Also Fyodor Yurchikhin, second from the right, and NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg there on the far right-hand side. The crew today is working throughout the entire space station on a variety of different maintenance and science tasks. Pavel Vinogradov has been transferring some water from the European Space Agency's automated transfer vehicle into the Russian segment of the ISS. This is done always. The ATV brings up quite a bit of cargo and supplies and also some water for the crew, so they're transferring that over into the tanks and doing some leak checks on the ATV once that has been completed later today. Alexander Mazurkin is working on some routine maintenance inside the Russian segment that is taking up basically his morning and his afternoon. He'll have some exercise later on today, but he has a fairly light day. Fyodor Yurchikhin has got a ham radio session with a school in the Ukraine. Both Yurchikhin and Mazurkin coming off a spacewalk last Thursday that lasted 5 hours and 58 minutes. That was the second spacewalk for these two in as many weeks. They took care of a number of tasks outside the station. They removed a space laser communication system from the hull of the Zvezda service module. They installed a pointing platform on which a small optical telescope will be installed on a future Russian spacewalk, and they also inspected the antennas on the Zvezda to ensure that they are fastened securely after one of the covers became dislodged and floated off into space. Here just a few days ago, that video is on the internet that Chris Cassidy saw that object floating away. The ground teams did take a look at that cover. Basically, it's part of the ATV's rendezvous system that comes up toward the back end of the Russian segment. They deduced that the specific antenna that cover came off of is of no concern, so they're not worried about it, but they wanted to make sure that all the other antenna covers were securely fastened. And of course, they did take a look to make sure that that one cover that did float away was not going to pose any sort of threat to the International Space Station, but that they moved away fairly quickly and got out of the way of the space station, and there is no worry about that. Chris Cassidy is working on finishing out some work in the Japanese HTV. Right now there's several different cargo vehicles docked to the International Space Station. We just mentioned the European ATV. The Japanese HTV is over on the U.S. segment. It brought up several tons of supplies a couple of weeks ago. There's a layout of the current station. Right now you see HTV-4 down there on the bottom side of the Harmony node. You see the Soyuz 35 as well as the Progress 52. ATV-4 is back there at the back of the Russian segment, and the Soyuz 34 up there on top on the Poisk module. But Chris is going to be working on actually scavenging some of the light bulbs inside HTV, which sounds sort of unusual, but obviously there are lights inside HTV. HTV is going to be deorbited and burned up here in a few days. So what the crew typically does, anytime one of these visiting vehicles comes up that's going to be destroyed at the end of its mission, they take the light bulbs out because they can actually use those inside the space station itself. He's also working on an experiment called the Sphere's Rings today. Everybody who has ever watched Space Station Live knows about the Spheres experiment. They ran this experiment last week, and he's going to continue powering up and doing some training on this fairly cool experiment that takes a look at how satellites free float and fly in formation up in space. This specific Sphere's Rings experiment also looks at formation flying and also some wireless power transfer to where two satellites could actually swap power with each other without actually touching. This particular experiment, the Sphere's Rings, is run out of DARPA as well as the University of Maryland. Luca Parmitano working on setting up the combustion integrated rack. That experiment continues right now as we go on the air. He set that up so that the ground teams both here in Texas and in Alabama can run that experiment. The ground teams are taking a look at the inside of that particular combustion integrated rack, which you see the full size of it there as we speak. He's also taking some water samples throughout the U.S. segment today. They always do that to take a look and make sure that the water is acceptable and that there's nothing growing in it. Karen Nyberg finally working on In Space 3. This takes a look at fluids that change properties based on magnetic fields. These fluids have certain things called colloids inside them, which is basically some particles that whenever you add a magnet to it, that actual fluid can become solid. It can change characteristics. This has important implications on possibly brake systems here on Earth in your car and trucks, something like that. Also robotics. These kind of colloids could also be used in bridges and buildings to help them weather through earthquakes or items of that nature. She's also transferring some items from the HTV that'll take up later on this afternoon. The ground team's also working today to work on some robotics. They're going to stow the special purpose dexterous manipulator, or Dexter, as we call him, later on today. And then they're going to take the Canadarm2, the station's robotic arm, and walk off to a different part of the station. The exposed pallet that came up on HTV, which is sort of the center section of that cargo vehicle that brought up unpressurized cargo, is currently attached to the forward end of the Kibo module on the exposed facility that's sort of the front porch of Kibo. It's going to be returned, and that tray is going to be slid back into the HTV coming up on Friday. And then HTV is actually going to be unberthed and released on September the 4th. It'll hang out in space for a few days, and it'll be deorbited coming up on September the 7th. Another important note, departure preps continue for Chris Cassidy and his fellow crew members Alexander Mazurkin and Pavel Vinogradov. Their time in space coming up to an end here in just a few weeks. They launched back in March and headed up to the International Space Station. They're actually going to be coming home, coming up on September the 10th U.S. time. Of course, we'll have live coverage of that here on NASA television as his crew lands down in Kazakhstan, the same country in which they launched from. But they've got about an hour of departure preparations on board the space station today. Of course, as one crew goes home, another one gets ready to come up. Mike Hopkins and his fellow crew members, Oleg Kotov and Sergei Ryazansky, are reviewing procedures today at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia, for next week's final qualification simulations. They basically have some tests they have to go through, and they're getting ready to launch coming up at the end of September. And also with that in mind, we want to remind you that we've got a crew news conference coming up with Expedition 38 and 39 coming up at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time here on NASA television. That'll be on Wednesday.